Morning, everyone. We're picking up today from page 11 on the last paragraph, and that is the start of Basil's account of how he and Dorian met one another. So just a couple of things that we'll focus on for today. The first one is just to say to you that this account gives us a lot of insight into Basil and Dorian and what Dorian means to Basil, but it also gives a very nice reflection of Victorian society. My advice to you when you start studying this novel, once you read it for the second time, is to isolate all of the descriptions of the social occasions in the upper classes, the gentry or the aristocracy, if you like. And you'll get a very good overview of how the attitudes of your upper classes worked and how Victorian society worked. So just remember to do that for yourselves. We're not going to look at a lot of quotes today on Victorian society, but we are just going to open at the start of this paragraph just to make a comment. So we're picking it up in the last paragraph of page 11. Where Basil starts his account of his and Dorian's first meeting. But he says this to Harry. He tells him that he had been invited to a crush, so a crush would have been like a get-together of the upper classes, or a soiree, or a luncheon, something to that effect. And he says, you know, we poor artists have to show ourselves in a society from time to time, just to remind the public that we are not savages. With an evening coat and a white tie, as you told me once, anybody, even a stockbroker, can gain a reputation for being civilized. So there in that quote you see once again the attitude of your gentry or your upper classes, who would have regarded the working classes way beneath them. And as I've mentioned before, the only reason why Basil gets invited to these sort of events is because he's a good artist and he occasionally graces them with his presence. But the attitude there is clear when he says we have to prove that we are not savages and that one has to dress up to be considered civilized. The other thing we learn about Victorian society here is the idea of the reputation, that everything in your upper classes was about appearance. It was not about who you really were. The Victorians' upper classes were not concerned with the real person. Everything was about how you appeared, what was the impression that you made in society. Now, if you read through the story closely of Basil's account, you will see that attitude coming across through and through. But then we pick up with where he encounters Dorian for the first time. And it's still part of this paragraph, a few lines down, and he says this: I knew that I had come face to face with someone whose mere personality was so fascinating that if I allowed it to do so, it would absorb my whole nature, my whole soul, my very art itself. And of course, as this chapter and the next chapter develop, we see that that is in fact exactly what has happened, that Basil has become almost obsessed with Dorian. We would refer to Dorian as his muse, as an inspiration to his art, and he believes, as we will see later, that he has inspired him to a new style of art. But more importantly is the impact that Dorian Gray has on him, that even in this very first encounter, Dorian Gray seems to make this impression on him. And we see that it would appear that everyone that comes into contact with Dorian Gray has this kind of impression, that he seems to have a charisma about him that is very alluring and very appealing to people. And it is why later on in the novel he is forgiven for so many of the terrible things that he does, because people have this attraction to him that we see Basil share here in this chapter. So he continues a few lines further down, and he says, I had a strange feeling that fate had in store for me exquisite joys and exquisite sorrows. So this is another example of foreshadowing in the novel, where Basil has the sense that wherever this relationship goes, it's going to bring him pain. And of course we see that in chapter 12. If you read my comment to Seren on the WhatsApp group, you will have seen I explained that chapter 12 is one of the most important chapters in the novel, and you'll see the foreshadowing being fulfilled in that chapter. He then goes on to say to Basil that Basil must see him as some sort of a coward because of the way that he views Dorian. And Basil gives this response, and this is paragraph 2 of page 12. He says to Basil, "Conscience and cowardice are really the same things, Basil. Conscience is the trade name for the firm." And we see a couple of things here about Harry, and they're really, really important. Excuse me. That Harry is projected to us essentially as an amoral character. He is not concerned with consequence. He is not concerned with conscience. And so he makes this remark about conscience and cowardice being the same things. What he's suggesting by that is that conscience is what makes us avoid certain actions because we believe them to be wrong. They prick our conscience. And if we engage in those activities, we might suffer from a guilty conscience afterwards. And he suggests that that is cowardice, that it's got nothing to do with the sense of right and wrong. It's just we don't want to get into trouble, and so we avoid them. This links in with the comment that he made about the church, as we mentioned in an earlier lesson, when he says that the church simply teaches us not to think. Again, it's this whole idea for Harry that one should not be dwelling on issues of right and wrong. One should simply be pursuing pleasure. That's the hedonist. A hedonist is someone who is essentially amoral. They pursue pleasure without thought to consequence or whether it's morally right or wrong. And then we jump a couple of pages and we continue with Harry's attitude, and Dorian has given his account of meeting, Basil has given his account of meeting Dorian, and he says that, they laughed at something that Lady Brandon had said. And Harry says something about laughter being a good way to start a friendship, and then he makes some innate comment about friendship. And Basil says this about him, and we're picking this up now at the second last paragraph of page 13. Hallward shook his head. "You don't understand what friendship is, Harry," he murmured, "or what enmity is, for that matter. You like everyone. That is to say, you are indifferent to everyone." This observation of Basil's about Harry is really important, because this again is a reference to the predator. Someone who has a predatory nature and who is not a moral character is a person who does not become emotionally connected to people. Instead, they use people for their own entertainment, and they remain indifferent to the joys or sorrows of the people they engage with. And you will see that character developing in Harry as he and Dorian Gray develop their so-called friendship, that there is an indifference in him because he is essentially superficial, and he is more interested in the entertainment value of relationships than he is in the people with whom he has relationships. And he responds to Basil and shares a similar sentiment. So the following paragraph, a few lines into it, he says, "I choose my friends for their good looks, my acquaintances for their good characters, and my enemies for their good intellects. A man cannot be too careful about the choice of his enemies. I have not got one who is a fool. So once again, we see in Henry his ability to manipulate people. What's important is that he clearly understands the human psyche very well, and that is why he's able to manipulate it. And so he is able to use and abuse people as he sees fit, and he chooses very carefully the people with whom he has relationships, and it has nothing to do with emotional connection. What's also important here is that Basil sees through Harry, and that's why Harry is unable to manipulate Basil. Basil sees Harry for what he is. He's wary of him, but he still regards him as a friend. But he is not manipulated by him, as opposed to Dorian, who falls into Harry's trap, and we'll have a look at that in chapter 2. Another comment that is made about Victorian society is on page 14, 2/3 of the way down. And here we see Harry's attitude and the Victorian attitude to the lower classes. He says, I quite sympathize with the rage of the English democracy against what they call the vices of the upper orders. The masses feel that drunkenness, stupidity, and immorality should be their own special property, and that if any one of us makes an ass of himself, he is poaching on their preserves. And at the end of the paragraph he says, I don't suppose that 10% of the proletariat live correctly. So we see him here having a very scathing attitude towards the lower classes. He almost implies that the only thing that they are able to own is immorality, and that's why they guard it and they don't want the upper classes to have anything in it. The proletariat is essentially the working class, but when you use the word proletariat, it's usually used with negative connotations. It's the lower classes, it's the masses, it's the people who have to engage in physical labor. And so he has this attitude that they are only capable of immorality. And so we see the hypocrisy of the Victorian era, where everything for your upper classes was about appearance. They would appear to be moral, but underneath the surface they were not moral, and they were engaging in just as immoral acts as anybody else. But they had to keep up appearances because that immorality belonged to the masses. It was the way that they could keep them at bay. They could look down upon them as people not worthy of their attention. But in themselves, they kept up appearances with no other thought to what their real lives were really like. So we're going to end today's little lesson there in terms of what we've learned about Victorian society, because tomorrow we're going to focus most of the lesson on the impact that Dorian has had on Basil. Have a look through it, make sure that you've read it, because once we're finished with chapter 1, we are going to be moving a lot quicker through the rest of the novel. I'll chat to you on Friday. Thanks. Bye.